Architecture has been around for as long as human beings have existed. Even before the Dutch made Cape Town a halfway port to India, architecture existed in the southernmost tip of Africa. Because of the nomadic nature of the early locals of the Cape, these structures would be torn down to be reused at another site. Hence the prevailing thought that indigenous people never had any sense of architectural heritage nor identity. Whereas the actual truth was that architectural style did exist, but not in the form that Westerners could recognize, simply because the mindsets were different. Westerners thought of land as being your sole property that could be cultivated to increase personal wealth, increase social status, and be passed on to your posterity. Indigenous people thought of land as belonging to the whole rather than to the individual, and private land ownership was seen as impossible. How could one own the land is probably what they thought. Fast forward, and the Cape Colony was set up to be a refueling station for the long voyage to India. Dutch settlers built the Castle of Good Hope as rumors of a war between the Netherlands and England intensified. In the Cape, under the management of the VOC, a strict hierarchical structure was enforced. However, this gradually transformed when a second and third generation of freeburgers, who were originally classified as peasants and considered low-class people, received land. And as a result, their perception of low within the Cape society changed. They began to accumulate wealth, which resulted in the stratification of the farming society. As these families grew and became more prosperous, farm owners began to upgrade their simple farm dwellings within large floor plans and added prominent gables. The houses became a way of communicating wealth and status. Cape Town was still a fairly small town. Cape Town had started to import slaves and immigrant workers from Asia and enslave the indigenous peoples to contribute to the growth of the town. Urban expansion from the city core took place through two patterns. The first was the construction of rental housing built to house the city's immigrant and working class. This pattern began when former slave owners used the funds they received from the British Crown upon the abolition of slavery to construct housing up the slopes of Signal Hill in what would become known as Bo-Kaap. This continued with the development of District 6 on the other side of the city centre, located just above the city's harbour and between the centre and the developing rail terminus. District 6 was the first place new immigrants to the city arriving from land or sea would settle. Similar development continued southward to areas such as Woodstock, Salt River, and Observatory. This particular pattern of growth, in addition to the patterns of social relations, produced an unequal but somewhat integrated city. That's why Cape Town is considered more racially mixed than other South African cities, setting up Cape Town's supposed history of liberalism. In 1910, the Union of South Africa came into being, needing an identity to bring together both British and Afrikaner cultures together under the banner of a white Africa. This identity would be the encapsulation of the triumph of European conquest over the black continent of Africa. Cape Dutch architecture became the ideal image to promote the common cultural identity to both English and Afrikaner communities. After unification, the goal was the creation of a nation, European in origin and extending domination over African, colored, and Indian groups. Cape Dutch architecture was always associated with the wealthy. However, these organizations in charge at the time co-opted Cape Dutch architecture and began to incorporate it into cities and towns around South Africa. The Cape Dutch architectural revival drew on a nostalgic strand from the past and projected it into the future to promote a common, new, and post-Union national identity. English and Afrikaner speakers were provided with a common architectural language derived from this adopted common Dutch heritage. By the mid-1930s, opinion amongst architects was starting to turn against Cape Dutch as the prevailing and dominant South African style. From the 1930s, they began instead to promote modernism and the international style over Cape Dutch vernacular forms once the National Party came into power in 1948. The apartheid state of the National Party proceeded to promote and preserve white cultural heritage, the VOC and the Cape Dutch architecture being some of the symbols of a nationalist white heritage construct. When the Spanish flu erupted in Cape Town in 1918, the city's first native location was constructed. To supposedly address the plague, the native dock workers and many other black people living across Cape Town were forcibly removed to this new location. While the plague actually arrived in Cape Town with European sailors, the construction of the location and the removal of racialized bodies reflected the modern impulse to use sanitation as the impetus for urban control. Architects in Cape Town were trying to introduce the modernist movement taking grip across the Western world. Cape Town was focused on getting Cape Town on par with the international cities, so expansion was in the works. The model introduced to facilitate expansion was the introduction of garden cities. The garden city model was introduced to Cape Town as an alternative to the crowded dwellings and narrow streets that bred disease. The most prominent example being the formation of Pinelands. Richard Sutherford was the man that championed the garden city model, and he used his personal funds and access to government to initiate the construction of Pinelands, which was located adjacent to Ndebeni, a location established upon the plague outbreak in 1918. Langa was created as a permanent township used to replace Ndebeni once it was realized that the location would become a permanent feature of the Cape Town landscape. As was practiced in South Africa, town planning was concerned with cleanliness and control in ways that links aesthetics with morality. The essential characteristics of Langa was that Africans were only temporary urban residents and that any family life was to be discouraged. Families remained in rural areas while men were accommodated in hostel blocks. Pinelands was shaped in a circular form and surrounded by a ring of railroad tracks. Maitland was quickly constructed on one side of Pinelands to house coloureds, and Langa was built on the other side to house blacks. Architects were in charge of the design and the building of apartheid institutions. These were state apparatus, the institutions that accompanied the apartheid state and the new spaces of separation. The adoption of the flat as a basic residential unit for coloured people and the bachelor quarter for Africans occurred during this period. The New Town movement was one of the models that architects and planners used in the formation of several townships in and around Cape Town. The new towns were meant to act as an overspill for large metropolitan areas, but needed to attract industry to be viable. New towns were supposed to be located in the country and contained a limited population. Their purpose was to provide a complete urban environment including housing, employment, and recreation. However, these townships could not attract the industry required to make them self-contained. Khayelitsha was built next to Mitchell's Plain in the 1980s, with a substantial open space buffer separating the two. The buffer, which is still intact today, effectively discouraged interactions between two separate populations that had very much in common. Khayelitsha was meant to accommodate the increasing number of blacks that were moving to the cities since the influx laws had been abolished. The township was built on the far edge of the city and was unable to attract any stable form of employment. All of these new townships were built on the flawed assumption that residents would own a car and have a stable income. Neither of these necessities ever panned out for the majority of the residents who are still trapped in these townships today. In the end, all of the modernist space planning principles were simply composed of low-quality rental housing owned by local authorities. The industry that was supposed to make all of these places independent never really materialized, which left commuting long distances to work as the only option for most people. The unequal distribution of jobs and homes causes a one-way flow of rush-hour traffic, which creates much congestion throughout the city. The railway system is also suffering from the one-way flow, and its infrastructure is deteriorating from the lack of investment over the last 30 years. It's estimated that at the peak times during the city, the trains are running above 100% capacity. The majority of wealth is contained in predominantly white places of the city. The wealthiest people live in mansions alongside the Table Mountain in places such as Sea Point and Camps Bay. The Cape Flats have very low monthly income rates. When everyone is living in the neighborhood is poor, it becomes much harder to maintain the infrastructure because very little extra income or advanced skills are present in the community. Many of the open spaces left for the public in townships often devolved into dust bowls and garbage dumps. Within the segregated townships, the poorer members of society do not have access to the informal social networks that help affluent members of the population find jobs in wealthier communities. Dangerous townships have made residents of Cape Town doubt the ability of the local authority to successfully police the city. This has led to the privatization of public spaces in areas where residents can afford to pay for the additional protection. Cape Town's growing security industry and an architecture of fear in wealthier areas. High walls with security gates and bars surround houses of wealthier residents and high-end shops. The private security industry is filling the gap of the well-functioning police departments in wealthier areas, while the rest of the population is being left to deal with crime on their own. Most businesses and places of employment remain in the center of town, far from the townships of the marginalized Cape Flats, the huge buffer zones between communities of different races and classes, the product of militaristic urban planning, remain intact in the architecture of the city. Cinemas, shopping malls, and supermarkets are located in predominantly rich, white-populated areas. Businesses cluster in blocks and shops congregate in complexes of malls. Fear of crime is pervasive in Cape Town's lower income areas and is a major cause of depression and stress. The narrow, winding streets of various townships were singled out as being particularly dangerous. The situation is particularly bad in informal areas, where narrow, sandy lanes do not allow police cars to pass through, and police have generally been found not to patrol on foot in these informal areas. In addition to crime and poverty, depression and stress amongst participants in all three areas were clearly influenced by socio-economic factors such as poverty and unemployment, bad living conditions, and especially in lower income areas, people's sense of an inability to create for themselves and a living environment which they could consider healthy, safe, and dignified. Whereas people in nicer areas at least felt more protected from crime and violence when they were inside their homes. Another source of stress for many who are living in lower income areas is a rampant substance abuse, usually alcohol, and the fear of the violence caused by abusing these substances. And people abuse these substances to find an escape from their reality. Social capital is defined as the social networks and interactions that inspire trust and reciprocity among citizens. Social capital has been found to be linked to more than just good health, but also leads to the proper functioning of a democracy, the prevention of crime, and the enhanced economic development. Most contemporary urban subdivisions do little to enable social interaction. Social interactions are far more likely to occur by invitation and not by chance encounter. Life is supposed to take place within the home or in the backyard. Because of the prevalence of fear within our society, we have a natural instinct of being highly guarded around strangers. This mistrust of strangers is exacerbated when we come in contact with strangers from other cultures and races. Unfortunately, this breeds unease around others you are not familiar with, thus decreasing the chances of forming new social networks with those you see as different to yourself. Through the examination of space and time, we have seen the influence that architecture and town planning can have on a society, long after the first brick has been laid. Physical, political, and mental barriers have segregated us and thus made us unable to bridge gaps, mend bridges, and we have a lack of empathy for the social other. Through a hierarchical system set in place by bygone powers that were the seeds of separation were sown into our very fabric. Segregation has plagued our society from truly treating old wounds that have left very deep scars. We all carry the burdens from years gone by. Unfortunately, their physical presence still remains intact, always reminding us that we are different and not very equal. There is still hope that we as a society can go forth and learn from our mistakes of the past so that we can become better and more inclusive for everyone in Cape Town.